Hi, everyone. Welcome to MedCircle. I'm Kyle Kittleson and joined today by Dr. Daniel Hochman, who is a psychiatrist and addiction recovery specialist. I'm very excited to jump into our topic of conversation today. If you are not a MedCircle member and would like to join MedCircle and be able to participate in these types of discussions live and ask questions live, go to medcircle.com and join today. If you're a healthcare worker, a student, a teacher, military, we have discounts for you. So please email me, Kyle, at medcircle.com for discounts on your MedCircle membership. Dr. Hochman, while people are logging in here, they might be meeting you for the first time. So why don't you give a little introduction?
Yeah, I'm Dr. Daniel Hochman, and I'm a psychiatrist. I've got a private practice. I also do consulting in the area, and I've also built an online recovery program. And so yeah, I am a psychiatrist who's always very interested in looking at underlying issues, understanding the real nature of people's suffering. So I'm biologically oriented as a doctor and use medication, but my real mission is always to help people really understand themselves and demystify what's going on.
Fantastic. Well, Dr. Hochman, take it away.
Good. So here we've got what I call the current of addiction. And what this does is try and help people to understand that addiction is a pretty normal process, and it's something that happens when we're experiencing some form of pain, and so the current begins there. And so an emotional pain can be anything from major depression, diagnosed anxiety, panic disorders, but it can also be more vague sorts of things that sit with people. So boredom, frustrated with life, not where you want to be, unhappy marriage, really frustrated with work, all sorts of things. So any kind of emotional struggle there. And the current sort of goes on from there. And you'll see that the force sort of just keeps going, and that's why I call it a current. So when we don't feel well in our minds, we generate a craving. The craving is just simply the mind's way of saying, I want out of this. So I don't feel good. I'm frustrated with the day, or maybe just this long-standing, deeper depression. I want out. The out is the idea of how we're going to escape that. It could be a drink. It could be through exercise even. So it can really range. And so the craving is the idea. The idea is the escape. And when we follow through with the idea is when we move on in that current to actually the addiction. So the addiction phase, as I consider it, is actually just part of the more sort of larger current of addiction. So addiction is when we carry through.
I'm assuming we all have these emotional pains. That seems to be unavoidable. So why is it that some people would deal with their emotional pain in a healthy way while others turn to an unhealthy coping mechanism like addiction?
Yeah, exactly. There's a difference between people who just say experience depression and people who are depressed and have addiction. So the biggest difference, even people who have depression might have cravings as well, meaning if you're sad, you want a way out. But it's the sort of how heavily you're looking for a way out of that feeling that decides whether it's addiction or it stays depression, anxiety, or hopeless, or whatever it is. So if you're preoccupied with getting out of that state and cannot tolerate that state, you would have addiction. People with depression who don't have addiction or anxiety or anything, who don't have addiction, are actually better at tolerating that state. Even though they might be miserable, they might be very depressed, they actually are better at tolerating that state. And part of that has to do with where this whole current goes, actually, which is the false pleasure. So the idea in addiction is that when you complete this current, you're ending up in a state where you're either numbed or you feel euphoria. You feel really good. You're having a very good break from reality, from the suffering. And so people with addiction are training and always retraining this current and this process. It gets continually reinforced. And there's then a development of a reliance on this system of escaping pain and going towards pleasure. Whereas just depression, anxiety, there's not that trained pattern. They're better able to sit with the pain. So yeah, the false pleasure is where they wind up. And when you do that, well, then the guilt and shame sets in, and then you feel bad again. And that's where sometimes you get this sort of triggering of events. So you relapse, or you drink more than you want, you made a fool of yourself, and then they go home and secretly now go on a binge. And that binge, is because it's recycling around now. There's that false pleasure made you feel so badly, and it becomes actually now the source of suffering, especially if you feel very guilty about a relapse. So health to me is when you're just living outside of this current altogether. You can address actually each part of this current, and any one of these, if you shut off or wind down, the current dies down. So health is not just through shutting those down. When I treat people, I'm trying to shut down each of these components so that if any one of them comes back, you're still okay. Even if two come back, you're still okay. But even beyond that, not even dealing with the current at some point and just actually being totally outside of it. So if you were, in this current metaphorically, it'd be like just being on the river's edge, watching it. You're watching what goes on. You still experience life. You still have pains. You still have cravings even, and those come up, but in more appropriate ways and contained, and you're still mostly just removed from it.
Mm-hmm. This really resonates with me, especially when I consider some of the literature I've read on mindfulness or meditation, being able to take that step back and watch things happen rather than, feeling that full experience. Of course, I don't want people to not feel anything, but that's how it resonated with me when you said that.
Yeah, and mindfulness is absolutely a proven strategy and technique to help in this. And it's probably the most relevant in the cravings and the false pleasure parts of this. Mm. The cravings, being able to tolerate these wants and desires. That's a very Buddhist philosophy, actually, to tolerate our wants, the wanting mind, and then the false pleasure too. The idea that, are we even, is the goal of life even to be in this pleasurable state? That's kind of hedonist, right? To be in this pleasurable state. And this starts to span into all sorts of things, right? Like consumerism and things that, we're always clicking and wanting and buying and consuming, right? And that's based partly on this premise of, a false pleasure, escaping reality with these pleasures. So yeah, absolutely, that's part of it. And when I treat people, mindfulness is absolutely a part of this picture.
Excellent.
So what we can go through here now are some of the common myths about addiction. A lot of people think of it in ways that I find really get in their own way of moving forward. And when we don't think of addiction in proper, up-to-date ways, we waste our efforts often. So one of those myths is that 50 or more % of addiction is caused by our genetic makeup. And that, it's true, scientists have identified these so-called addiction genes, and it sounds very scientific. And so a lot of the consensus will say it's like half and half, it's half nature, half nurture. And I think it's important to kind of dispel this myth, not because, genes don't exist or have anything to do with addiction, but because genes only help determine our traits, sometimes our temperament, but they don't actually determine our actual behaviors or our choices. So the genes determine a part of our traits, but they don't determine what we actually do, what we say, how we behave, what we choose. And so that would be like saying, because the genes make you tall, that you're a basketball player. That'd be ridiculous, right? I mean, most tall people aren't so great at basketball. Same thing here, right? Genes can make us risky. So we might have a high risk tolerance. So people with, the heavier, more risky addictions might have that temperament genetically, but you can also be a risk taker in the investment world. You can be an entrepreneur. You could be a skydiver. You could, talk in front of people that you don't know. There's a bunch of other ways to take risks. So addiction is just one of those choices. There's other things that come into that final determination of what we end up doing with our lives. The other thing is that genes are always turning on and off. So the idea that genes, decide all these things or that they're static is wrong. We now know genes are turning on and off from little and big things. They're affected from birth. They're affected from what we eat. They're affected by hormones. They're affected by the sun. They're affected by all sorts of things, minute to minute, hour to hour, month to month. And if you don't believe this, just think about this. We have the same genes that make up our eye, as make up our heart, as make up our toes. So it's the same genes making these things. The body is quite good at learning where to turn different parts of our genes on and off. And this is a regular part of genetic operation. And we've got good studies to back all this up. So primates, we've looked at, monkeys and see that the ones that have these so-called addiction genes turn off when they're given the proper nurturing. So you could take no genetic predisposition to addiction and raise them in a harsh, cold way, and they have addiction. And the opposite's true. You take all the addiction genes in a monkey, you raise them with nice warmth, touch, so the researchers will measure actually, how much touch and warmth and stroking and all that they're getting to feel secure, and they don't have addiction. So these things get turned on and off profoundly. This happens early in pregnancy as well. So there are certainly translations from that research to what we see in human life. And the most esteemed people like Lance Dotis, comes through the literature and with a critical eye, often there are many other people who would say there's just no such thing as a gene for alcoholism. And this goes for other addictions too.
Okay.
So another common myth that circulates is that there are brain abnormalities that cause addiction. You might have heard, or I certainly get a lot of patients and they say, I was just kind of born like this. They just kind of come in and it's fixed. I am just this way. I was born like this. I'm always compulsive. I'm always, impulsive and go, for addictive things. And it is true that there's differences in brain activity of addict versus non-addict. But that's sort of a confusing picture because there's differences in brain activity between anything. I mean, we could look at the brain activity of any person pre and post anything or in different parts of the world, different ways of studying. You're always going to find these differences. And so everything we do changes the way our brain grows, changes the way it's made up. And a really clear example of this, it's a really nice study done, followed cab drivers. And we were able to track very, very clearly and document that cab drivers were very good at growing spatial awareness and knowing where they were in their brain. So you could measure them pre and post or measure cab driver versus non-cab driver and see a huge amount of differences, not just in the spatial parts of the brain, but even takes over other parts of the brain. So the brain's very adaptable and it learns these things. And so the idea that addiction is like set from earlier and that the brain works differently is a misattribution. It is true that there's a difference, but it's not causal from some sort of set thing at birth. It's actually because of a training. When you train yourself to escape pain with pleasure, you're training your brain and you're going to have a certain dopamine pathway get reinforced over and over again.
So are you saying then that you believe that there aren't people who are more predisposed to develop addiction?
I think that there is some slight predisposition, like there are some genes that slightly predispose you. There are temperaments that slightly predispose you. There might be, and so there would be, you could call it a brain abnormality. I wouldn't call it an abnormality, but that could be part of a temperament, let's say, to be more impulsive than someone else. So those you could say are predispositions, but first of all, none of them are deterministic. They're not going to mean that you have an addiction. And second, they aren't things that are fixed. So they'd all be adaptable. So even if you were impulsive, you can absolutely build skills that reduce that impulsivity. like you're talking about
Right.
earlier, with certain meditative forms. I mean, we can grow cortical activity to insert into the impulsive regions of the brain, and that can be trained. There's nothing about this that's fixed. I have never once seen someone with addiction that is just stuck that way and can't get out.
Good. That's powerful. That's really powerful. And I hope people, if you didn't get that and you're watching this on replay, that's a stop and rewind moment right there. Please continue, Dr. Hochman.
Yeah. So that is, I think, why you're seeing why when I don't like that certain myths that don't even have legs in science persist when it gets in the way of what people can do in their treatment, right? If you believe you're just born this way, genetics, if you believe that, I've got an abnormal brain, you're going to give up, or you're going to think you're in this uphill battle forever, and you're not going to do the productive things in your treatment to get better. So that's why these are so important. These aren't just sort of facts to debunk for fun. This has everything to do with the course of treatment. So let's go to the next one. And I think this will be the last myth that we'll discuss. There are many, but the last one here is that addiction is a choice. And the best representation of this is Nancy Reagan, who I'll pick on a little bit, although I have every reason to think she was well-intentioned and kind-hearted. So don't pick on her character, but just that she was using flawed science that was given to her, the idea that addiction's a choice. And so you just say no. And so Kyle, if I came up to you and, we're adolescents getting into trouble and I say, hey man, you want some drugs? And all it is, you just have to say no. There's just a logical choice. Drugs are bad for you. You see the egg on the frying pan thing, or, that it's going to cost you friends. It's going to get you into trouble with the law. You're not going to get into the career you want. Just don't do drugs. That's never worked. Logic does not help treat addiction. So
that's hard for me to hear as a very logical person. Mm-hmm. And, I know if my dad heard that and I was using drugs, he wouldn't be able to understand that. He'd be like, what do you mean? He knows it's bad and he does it anyway. This doesn't make any sense. So can you explain a little bit what you mean by the logic does not work here?
Yeah, I would go more global than that. I mean, logic does not help our emotional state or our behaviors almost ever. If it did, let's put it this way, if it did, we all know you go to bed on time, you wake up, you eat a healthy meal, you exercise, you keep good friends, you're responsible, you do your homework, you show up at a job, you do all these nice things, right?
Right.
I don't know anyone, including me, that can do that on a consistent basis.
You're right.
Everyone already knows the logic of life and what we're supposed to do, and yet none of us can do it. So if that's not enough evidence experientially for why, logic is just not what drives how we actually operate as people, then I don't know how to help you if that doesn't make enough sense. And so
the chat right now is saying logic does not treat addiction, and people are resonating with that statement. Thank you for that.
I'm really glad to hear that, really, because you can see when you talk about, you can imagine your parents trying to say, hey, don't do that, or I don't understand why you do that, son. It's a bad choice. That's the miss, right? The miss as a parent, but also then the responsibility of a mental health provider, is not to respond with logic. And everything in your intuition says, well, okay, I just need to explain to this person why it's such a bad idea. But that is not how we operate. You've got to meet people in these other ways that deals with how their choices are actually coming to be. And so what I'd cue people into is that what really happens is we're acting in what's called implicit ways all the time. By far, our choices and our actions are made based on implicit or automatic sorts of activity. And that's just purely because we cannot dedicate a huge amount of our brain function for all our little choices all the time. What I'm doing with my hands even, that's just automatically happening. Mm-hmm. I'm not deciding I'm going to put my hand up and then I'm going to move it here. It just, these things happen. So that happens with our choices, with everything all the time, is we're automatically being driven. by a whole host of things that make up who we are. And so I don't think of this as a choice or logic issue. Instead, I call this a consciousness problem, because we need to be able to tease and pull up the right components and be as specific and constructive as possible in growing consciousness around the most productive things we can do for ourselves.
This is awesome. This is awesome. I mean, this is, if you're watching this and that resonated with you, I would recommend that your next MedCircle viewing is a series we did with Andrea Arlington and Dr. Dominic Sportelli. They talk about addiction, and they go into more of these types of concepts as well. That video is available in the MedCircle library, watch.medcircle.com. Thank you, Dr. Hochman. Keep going.
Yeah, so we're kind of tearing down some of the myths, hopefully building up new understandings. Okay, well, if it's not those things, so what does cause addiction becomes the question that I think ought to be what's asked from there. And the fact is, I don't consider it like, you know, I'm healthy, I don't have addiction. That guy does have addiction. I see him drinking a lot. We all share and have the addiction pathway. We have that not just because it's like unhealthy or something. We have it because we need it. This is where semantics, the words we use, matters incredibly. Because if we think of addiction as this just separate disease process and that other people don't have it, we miss what is even happening. And this starts to get underneath this logic and stuff. We have to have a mechanism to want things. Any species needs that, right? You need to want food. You need to want shelter, security. You need to want to procreate as well, any species at least, not necessarily one individual, but the species needs to be designed to procreate. So we are built to want things, and there has to be a biological mechanism for it. It's not robotic, right? We're not born with instructions saying, here's what you should do and here's what should be right. Instead, it's just built into us. These are things, the things that protect us as an animal species, those things are built in to be things that we want. And so that's all addiction really is hijacking. That's what it's using. So it's using the circuit that is a reward pathway. Love feels good, security feels good, having a good job feels good, good friends feel good, all that stuff feels good. The addiction pathway is what perpetuates the motivation to do that, that the reward from a hug, from a, you know, people liking our work, that reward feels good. That's the addiction pathway. It's only when we do that with unhealthy things that are inserted into there that it would be what we colloquially call addiction. So if you do that with heroin, okay, that's addiction. If you do that with healthy work or with love, we don't use the word addiction, but it's using the same exact pathway. And these brain images show that, right? Sugar activates this pathway more than cocaine because we need food, right? And you can say, okay, well, that's unhealthy though. It's too much food. Same thing happens. I can show you the same things with love. Love, same exact pathway, lights it up big time. So the addiction pathway is something we all have.
You know, that's so interesting that you said that, because I have been watching some quarantine reality TV shows of people falling in love in all these different, you know, remarkable ways. And I made the comment the other day to my dad. I said, it's like they're addicted to this. They're seeking out these feelings of love, and when they get it, I mean, they're just like, oh, they say it out loud. They're like, oh yeah, ooh, yeah. like as if it were a drug. And so now we have you, a psychiatrist, saying, yes, love is another way people cope or look for those reward, feelings.
Yeah, we have the bench research for it. We have our own experiences for it, and we see it happening. It's confirmed in every way. Yeah.
Wow, fantastic.
Let's look now at then how does addiction develop? And when we say addiction here, we're saying more of the bad addiction. So we all have this circuit, but why do some people then have more, traditionally bad addictions? There are 3 learned traits. We've learned these in very good longitudinal studies. And we see that the 3 things that are very predictive for addiction is a lack of belonging, You might, by the way, have people around you, but that doesn't mean you feel like you belong in a secure, warm way. So it's not just living with, people in your home. It's not just having people at work. It's actually feeling connected and secure. The number two is poor impulse control. So this is, you're a very impulsive person that just, gets frustrated, poor impulse control around choices, giving up quickly, stuff like that. And then emotional distress. So there's always some emotional pain that triggers this. So remember the current, there's always something that begins this current. So the emotional distress and the lack of belonging are very much part of the first part of the current with emotional pain. The poor impulse control comes in that third stage where the craving turns into action and we kind of give up and we say, F this, what does it matter? I don't care right now. That's the impulse control that leads from the craving to follow through with the actual behavior. We can go to the next one. And then this here, I like to go even further and say, well, how do you develop those traits then? So we named those three, but how do you even get to that? Why would you have poor impulse control? Why would you feel a lack of belonging? And these here are some of the commonest pathways. And nothing I'm talking about here is always 100% for everybody, but these are extremely common pathways. Addiction begins, first of all, long before your first drug. So it is not the model that a lot of people learned, a couple decades ago, that you take a hit and then that drug somehow takes over your brain and now you're addicted forever. Addiction, this trained pattern is already in motion long before you use the first object of your addiction. So you'll see here how that develops, which is one is getting a very results-oriented way of being. So a very high sort of emphasis on your grades, on what people have said of you, could be your looks, could be accolades and achievements. So looking always at results and not how hard you're trying or what you're doing, the thought process to get there. When it's results-oriented, it's very empty. It's a very frustrating way to be, and there's never enough, and you can't just enjoy yourself in the moment. Also being raised in a way where you're expected to please other people. So this can happen with narcissistic parents. This can happen with just culture too, that wants you and rewards you to be pleasing, to satisfy other people at your own expense. And that takes away your own sense of purpose. Life then becomes just this very boring slug. It's I just got to do this for other people. I don't even get anything out of it for me. And you start checking out. So it's very empty, kind of hollow existence. And then criticism is anything from, just always kind of being pestered and not being enough, to outright abuse. So of course, being abused is a heavy form of criticism. It's to say, I disrespect you so much that I will use you sexually. I will use you to hit you. I will control you. You're not enough. So criticism can of course be in all kinds of varieties. And that is part of the ways you develop a sense of not belonging. And we talked last time about the core beliefs, the core belief of I don't belong or I'm not good enough. Well, if you're told that enough times, and you're criticized for years and years, of course, you're going to feel like I don't belong, even when later on in life, people like you, they think you're funny, they enjoy your presence. But if you've been criticized, then you've been trained that you're not welcome, you don't belong. And people lash out against that. Feel hopeless, you'll do desperate things, and you get a lot of unhealthy behaviors. So the simple way to put all this is life just isn't fun. And what does this do to the brain? Let's just tie this back into the science that we see in the labs. When you have this childhood of life isn't fun, well then we do get brain changes. So remember, this isn't just genetics. This isn't because you're born that way. It's because you're being trained throughout childhood, adolescence, that life is bad, life is stressful. And if you're not getting healthy rewards, you have an underactive reward circuit, underactive dopamine system. If it's underactive and you're not getting enough of it, when you reach adolescence and when you get a little older and you can make your own sort of choices, you're going to find things that give you that hit. You're going to find ways to feel reward. It's what we do. We all want to feel good. So if you're not getting it internally, because those were taken from you and you're trained that you just don't deserve them, or you shouldn't get them, or you'll never get them, then you find it from the outside in the form of drugs, alcohol, or bad behaviors. And that is rewarding to use, drugs. It increases that dopamine release. You get that hit, it feels good. And the double whammy is that when you do that, your own body says, okay, if I'm getting enough of it externally, we're going to shut off our own production and not make dopamine on our own anymore. If you keep getting these hits 3 times a day, then why am I making it? And so your body actually becomes even weaker, and that's the reliance on addiction. These are all trained patterns.
Now, so I see on the graph here, cocaine, meth, alcohol, heroin, obviously huge, really destructive drugs. But what about things like food, television, social media, our relationships? If those things, exercise, if those things can be good for us and also give us those dopamine hits, does that also make our body weaker then? Because our body's like, we're getting dopamine because you're watching The Office, so we'll stop production on that.
Yep. That's exactly what happens.
Okay.
So drugs would be the most severe form of this, but you saw there, sugar, actually hits this more than cocaine. Stimulants tend to do this the most strongly, but yeah, you've got this whole host of different substances that do these in different profiles. But yeah, behaviors, food. So it's, it could be the food and the sugar, but it's also the behaviors. So porn addiction is extremely common. Sex addictions, workaholics, exerciseaholics. So yeah, those are safer kinds of things to be addicted to, but it is the same process, just healthier or less risky in outcome, but the same process is happening.
Got it. Yeah, understood. Excellent.
And so the last couple of things we're going to go over here is then trying to frame this in a way that's very productive. So we're kind of deconstructing unhelpful ways of thinking about it with those myths, trying to lay out the science here. Okay, how does it really work? How is addiction developing? So from there, well, if we know how it develops and we have good studies that show that now, well, then how do we need to think of it? How do we think of actually moving forward? And so the current we've already gone over now, this is a way of thinking about this so that everything we've talked about falls in here somewhere. If you address these parts of what I call the current, you will never leave out a component of addiction. So if you shut off the pain, the emotional pain, the distress, you shut it off. You don't have addiction. If you shut off that want for it, or you tolerate the want, you don't have addiction. If you fix the addictive part, which would be more superficial things in that phase, like, making sure you're hanging out with the right people, clearing the liquor cabinet, someone's watching your bank account, those accountability measures, that would do it. And that's where actually most treatments I see for addiction stay focused. It's on just these kind of rules and accountability. And you can see that's just a sliver of what's happening for someone who's addicted. So if you still have pain and you don't see through the cravings, then you might be able to hold yourself together with enough accountability and really take care of that addiction component of the current. But for how long, right? If you're a grown adult and you have a lot of distress and you can't tolerate your cravings, that's when you relapse, right? You're going to only last so long. You're motivated for a while, you've got the right friends, your partner's behind you, and they're with you all the time. But for how long, right? If you're a grown person, you're going to find your way to something if you're failing on those first two. And then same thing, false pleasure. You're going to shut this down altogether. So beyond that, living on that bank of the river, being able to watch this, see it unfold, understand yourself fully enough that there's other ways to feel reward. There's other ways to think of living. Addicts often, they're like at a loss for like, well, if I'm, not addicted, I want to find some other way to find reward. So they'll all usually flock to like the gym when they're getting healthy. They're not addicted anymore. And you see them, flock to do other things. And that's good. I encourage people to do that, and I still help my patients, to get to the gym instead. But that's not going to take you the distance forever. That's still using the current and manipulating the current. Much better to not even need the reward, not even need to like escape this pain. And there's profound ways of dealing with that. So yeah, this makes sure that you won't miss anything.
That is incredibly comprehensive, and the metaphor of the current really resonated with me. We're still going to ask us or have our members who are watching live ask you some questions, Dr. Hochman. But for you watching or listening to this, tomorrow we have another MedCircle live event with Dr. Hochman. It's on addiction treatment debunked, discovering the approach with a 90% success rate. Dr. Hochman is a board-certified psychiatrist and addiction expert. He is in Austin, Texas, and treats addiction issues in his private practice, while he's also worked with the various addiction treatments and addiction centers. So he knows what he's talking about and has the history to back it up. Let's go with this question from an anonymous attendee. On the current, why is this thing called false pleasure? And how is it different from real pleasure? What is the difference in the way you experience it?
Yeah, so I call it false pleasure because I'm certainly not being secretive about, it's not a good pleasure at the end. So there could be a euphoria and a high, that's what we would call the high, and you feel good for a while. So we could just leave it at calling it pleasure, but I differentiate that it's a false pleasure because it's an empty one, and it's short-lived, and it's not healthy. And I would call, to differentiate with a healthy pleasure would be the opposite of all that. It would be healthy because it's something that helps you in life, and it's something generally that lasts. So those are some clues to figuring out what's healthy and what's not as a pleasure. Clearly the high of a drug, is not as healthy as, the high of a really good hug or relationship. And so we know that common sense wise, but we could say, well, but how do we really know that? Is there a way that we can test or know that? And the test that I put it through to know if it's a healthy or unhealthy pleasure is, if we were to do more and more and more of it, would that be okay? Would that be better or worse for me? So that helps to kind of quickly throw it in one bucket or another. Are there some gray areas? Of course, but we all pretty well know that that the ones are just empty, shallow, short-lived, and wouldn't be good if we even did twice in a day or once in our whole life, are unhealthy.
Yeah, the unhealthy pleasure test. Perfect.
Yeah.
Anonymous attendee asked, I'm 56 and recently diagnosed with DID, dissociative identity disorder, from complex trauma from birth. I drink 20 to 30 ounces of wine and smoke pot every day. Will I be able to heal the traumas if I continue to drink wine and smoke weed? Does one need to break the addictions first, or else you can't heal?
Yeah, that's a good question, because as a psychiatrist, I see people not knowing how to enter treatment or what to do first. And our mental health field is guilty of confusing people. Sometimes if you knock on one door, they say, well, I can't treat your depression or your trauma in your case until you stop drinking or until you're not high anymore. And colleagues I have that I like say that and do that. They won't take you until you're clean and sober. I was even, taught that by some of my supervisors in residency. And then you've got people on the other end, right, who say, well, this is all your pain and your emotional distress is only a result of your addiction. And the truth is, it's always both. You need to be able to do these together. I don't like if someone has an addiction and trauma or mood issues to treat it with only one or the other. You really have to bring those treatments together, or at least combine the right treatments together to get that comprehensive look. And so a lot of it has to do with what someone's ready to do at the moment. I will never turn someone away in my practice if they're drinking a lot, they're getting high a lot. I'm not going to deprive them of the chance to work through their psychological and emotional issues. Why would I do that? It'd be foolish to me, and this is my own philosophy, but if the addiction, if we looked at that current, right, if it's coming from pain, and you who's asking the question, you've got trauma, that current is going to be way too uphill. If you just treat the addiction part, you've got too much of the current coming at it, to be expected to go, to stop that current by the time it gets to the addictive phase, which is when you're drinking or when you're getting high. So we've got to allow you to get help, right, to treat that trauma. But yeah, is it harder to treat the trauma when every day you're either high or kind of subtly withdrawing and probably got a lot more depression or anxiety going than necessary because of that? No, we wouldn't wait, right? You'd want to do everything at the same time. So yeah, whoever's asking, I think you can absolutely get better. Wherever you're ready to begin is fine. If it's more exciting and you're more ready to get sober, and you see, what happens from there, and then you go get treatment for trauma, that's fine. The other way will work fine as well. And the key is to finding a therapist, psychiatrist, counselor who gets that picture and isn't going to shame you because, you're doing it in the wrong order or in the wrong way. You want someone who accepts the state that you're in and can work with you as you are. If they can't work with you as you are, you're not working with the right person.
Well, as a reminder, MedCircle is not a treatment service and does not aim to replace or replicate treatment in any way. MedCircle and MedCircle Live sessions are for educational purposes only. We'll go to another member question. This member asks, wondering why you can't be raised or why you can be raised in the same home, and some people raised the same way end up in addiction and some do not.
Yeah, well, devil's in the details. So, we need to know what was going on there. And so I'm going to throw some things out that could be, totally off the mark or maybe hit the mark for this person, since I don't at all know their experience. But yeah, you might go through your own set of relationship issues or failures. You might go through a different, birth order has a lot to do with things too, a little harder on the first kid, more expectations on the first kid. There, of course, can be other things going on outside the home besides the relationships and romantic failures, but also just how athletic we are might help us get accepted more quickly, all that stuff. So there are always differences there. That, like I said, it's always in those details, but yeah, the home is certainly where we're getting a lot of experience, and you could think of it as a pretty controlled setting, but it's really not. It's not as controlled a setting as a lot of people think. It's very, very different. Different sets of friends, different teachers, different relationships, different activities, all that stuff. So, yeah.
MedCircle member WB asks, I keep hearing that marijuana is not addictive. However, if someone smokes daily and is in a constant stupor to where work, family, etc. doesn't matter anymore, is that the pleasure pain current only, or can it also be to a point of addiction?
Yeah, marijuana is certainly classified as an addictive substance, and I think appropriately. Is it as addictive as other substances? No. I mean, we have lab research. We can kind of actually measure and compare these things. And do I see people struggle as much trying to get off of it as other ones? Yeah, in different ways. So people who are trying to stop smoking weed are generally fighting more of sort of this internal battle than they are like with the withdrawal. So you try and stop alcohol, you're going to withdraw big time, and you're going to have a lot of physical dependence and sort of classic addiction barriers that make it hard to get off of. Marijuana is much more internal. So people that are addicted to marijuana are typically still using it very much to emotionally regulate, get through often anxiety, and often using it as a sort of sleep aid as well. And so until you kind of fix those reliances, it can still be hard to get off of, but less of the physiologic reasons and more of the psychological ones, needing to find, better sleep hygiene, sleep habits, also being able to kind of wind down and let things go, not be so wound up or anxious about things. What was the other part of that? I want to make sure I address everything. It's about that.
Well, I had already closed out the question
Okay.
when you started
There's something about pain,
talking.
and I wasn't sure if they were meaning.
But I got it. So yeah, she says, is that the pleasure pain current only, or can it be to a point of addiction? So I think you covered both.
Yeah. I'd say it's both. Yeah.
Okay. This anonymous attendee asks, what are some healthy ways to get over or deal with boredom and emptiness?
Yeah, and that gets into the health part of the current, which is just to be outside of that, because most of us are kind of led to believe we should be in this state where we're always stimulated and motivated and finding these rewards. And the reality is, again, look at just the animal kingdom. Animals do find reward when they hunt an animal and kill it or get food or procreate, but a lot of the time they are just sitting around laying on their side, and they're not looking for like stimulation and activity all the time. So part of the journey is actually reorienting your whole reward pathway so that you don't feel like you're trying to find a reward. So if you're bored and feeling empty, the goal is not always to just keep finding all these stimulating activities. And so on the weekend, I'm gonna hike, and then I'm gonna watch this, then I'm gonna get together with these people and do all these things and volunteer. That still comes from this idea of like I'm like always supposed to be stimulated and active and rewarded, and that's not really how we're built fundamentally. We're supposed to find reward in things as a product of life, but it's not supposed to be sort of the what we wake up to do, right? So
have you heard of these dopamine fasts?
Yeah.
Wait, well, what do you think of them?
Yeah, I think it's cool. I mean, the idea of like, it's sort of what you do on like a retreat, right? You would deprive yourself of this, of rewards and perhaps sort of sensitized to when they do come in these more natural ways. I think that can be used to kind of wake ourselves up, just like a good diet can do.
Yeah, exactly. And for people who go, what's a dopamine fast? My understanding is that it's a period of time, typically 24 hours, where you just intentionally deprive yourself of anything that could bring you joy. And this is the nitty gritty. So no music, no television, no social media, no internet, nothing. Like you just spend 24 hours with yourself. And then the idea is that the next day, you open your email and you're like, wow, I'm so stimulated by these emails. And you go outside and you're like, whoa, look at all the wind, And so I don't know, I've never done it, but it's on my to-do list.
Yeah. So there's a couple of things about that. One is, it can work to what we could say sensitize to rewards that next day, or pretend forever. You're more sensitized and enjoy them more. I like to push my patients hard though, and they know that. I would say go beyond that though. It's not about trying to sensitize yourself to more subtle stimulants. It is to not even feel like that's owed to you or deserved, or that's like the object. So you want those things to come when they come, naturally, when they arise. But you don't want to wake up thinking I'm going to try and find more reward. So the idea of sensitizing more to it, still to me, we can one up and do even better, right? Which is wake up and just exist and be. Things might happen in the day that feel good. And when they do, feel them entirely and connect with them. But the goal should never be to just become more and more sensitized to
right. Oof. Yeah, excellent. That really reframed my outlook on that. Thank you. SA asked, do you see social media as an addiction within the current?
Yeah. And I know people listening, some people are strict about the definition, especially people who are, have been addicted for decades, sometimes even take offense to calling other things addictions. And then other people are looser in their definition. I'm on the looser definition side. I think it doesn't mean that someone with a heroin or alcohol addiction, isn't suffering more, or, more at the precipice of death even. But I do think we need to be honest about what's happening. The process is the same. So yeah, from my philosophy, yes, we need to still be able to understand that when someone's incredibly compulsive, preoccupied with social media, looking for them to be liked and, worried about their picture they're posting and looking for those rewards, or just through observation, looking at other people's feeds and finding, all those little hits. Social media is designed to do this. It's not even nefarious and bad. I mean, it's just, of course, any business is going to want you to be more on their platform, consume more of their things. That's fine.
And hello, I want you to consume MedCircle videos, so yeah. Come on and do it,
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's fine. Right. I think we still are ultimately responsible for ourselves, and we need to, not just blame Facebook. We need to say, okay, I want to proactively use it from 5 to 6 in the evening and catch up with people or whatever. But, it's up to us to be proactive about how we engage in anything. And no one can take that right from us. So,
yes.
You'll be okay if you do that.
Is it possible to overcome addiction without the help of a professional?
Oh, yeah. We have studies and evidence to show that's the overwhelming majority get through this without professional help. Now, I wouldn't necessarily go around, screaming that from the mountaintops, because, I don't want more people than necessary to try for longer and longer on their own without professional help, and struggle for longer. So there's a lot of good professionals out there that understand how to help and can help you sooner, faster, longer lasting. But yeah, it'd be, not too far off from really anything, right? If you want to learn a subject, you can learn a subject. I love learning on my own. There's other things I know I need some guidance and sort of more formal instruction on. And same would go for training, exercising, whatever. You'll usually, if you have a good guide, and if you have a bad one, well, then that's crap. But if you have a good guide, you should be learning and growing, at a faster rate. It should be a little more enjoyable. It should be, take you farther than on your own. So that's one way, not just to think about, should I enter into professional help, but is the professional help I'm getting good? I mean, it should be more than you would be able to do on your own, or else.
Yeah. And again, I can't recommend enough our other series on addiction, especially we have a few with Andrea Arlington, watch.medcircle.com. Let's get in as many more questions as we can. We'll go a little past 11 since we started a few minutes late, but not too much. Anonymous attendee asks, I smoke pot daily and would like to smoke less, and not out of habit or addiction. I'm coming out as transgender and I'm working on healing my complex trauma and gender dysphoria, but haven't been able to find an effective replacement behavior for smoking. Can you give any more tips on redirecting my behavior?
Yeah, and this gets to some of what we talked about earlier. Could you transfer to healthier things? And we talked about like exercise as one of those. Could you find, pleasure in just watching, Netflix or other things? Those are the logical steps to help slowly, we call harm reduction. You're still in the current, but you're replacing and trying to find things that are not going to get you into as much trouble, or not, probably if you're smoking a lot, might make work harder, it might make things feel a little bit harder to get initiated. And those would be sort of the commonest downfalls. So yeah, replacing it with any of those, and, probably whoever's asking that question is capable of coming up with other things besides, Netflix or hikes or exercise. So you can certainly find your own things to replace that with. But again, the goal would be not to feel like you're in this never-ending scramble to replace or find healthier objects of stimulation. Instead, I'd still say you eventually want to be outside of that current, on that riverbank, watching it, in this, what that means is watching your own mind, watching how desperately you're trying to belong, perhaps, right? If you're transgender, if you've had trauma, odds are you're trying to find your place and find a sense of belonging. Does that mean you find other people of your sexual orientation? Does it mean that you find anybody who accepts you as you are? What does that mean for you? Might mean that you're connecting in ways that have nothing to do with your sexuality. Just because that's your story right now and on your mind, you might want to connect more with people that like philosophy and read books and have a book club. Like there's other ways to feel that, and that's where that belonging comes in as well, with one of those traits of addiction. So it would be to try and figure out other ways of existing outside of looking for just a replacement.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Hochman, do you have a patient right now, or do you have 3 more minutes?
I have 3 more minutes, so we're good.
Okay, we'll do one more question then. SK asks, why are people who deal with addiction in denial about their problem, and why does relapse happen?
I think there's a lot of denial because of the way that we talk about it. There's a problem with, and that's what I try to debunk, and thanks for doing this. I mean, this is what this is about. It's when we think of, I'm healthy, I don't have addiction, and that person over there does. That's the stigma. The stigma is that you're different, there's something wrong with you, and you either disgust me or scare me, right? That's the stigma. There isn't stigma unless we're making it this different, wrong thing. Instead, we need to be able to accept and normalize people's experiences and how they deal with life. And that's different than saying, go on and keep drinking and that's fine and good. It's just saying, okay, you're a pretty normal person, right? We all have the addiction pathway, and yours has been hijacked, and there's something going on for you then. And there should be curiosity around trying to help that person and what they're suffering with. And there wouldn't be stigma if we could talk about it as matter-of-factly as that. But we don't. And instead, it's this scary or disgusting thing, and so that's where the stigma comes up. And so if there's stigma there, why would you admit to it? Why would you let everyone know what your struggle is? Often when people start, peer groups or trying to be sort of honest about their addiction, they feel like they're supposed to sort of tell everyone and be honest with everyone, and that's a lot to ask someone when there is stigma. You will be judged. It could be judged at work. You could have friends that are scared that you're going to drive drunk with them or not be, dependable or just be dangerous to be around, or, it's a turnoff for a lot of people. So why would you feel comfortable telling everyone? So it's something that is appropriately something to be, to come out with the right people at the right time and be sort of intentional. I think it's great to be honest, but it's another thing to just overly expose yourself. And so I think that's a normal part of this process, to have the stigma. Yes. And to deny it.
Yeah. Dr. Hochman, thank you for your insight today with the presentation and also answering our questions. We're going to have more from Dr. Hochman in our next MedCircle live event. The next one is all about addiction treatment, and Dr. Hochman's method, I guess I can call it, that's having 90% success rates. That'll be tomorrow. You can register using the links below, or you can register at medcircle.com/live. You will need to be a MedCircle member to join that event. You can always start with a free trial. Dr. Hochman, thanks for being here. And remember, whatever you're going through, you got this.